Mahesh, do you have a slightly less nuanced position?
No, no. Well, let me come to a slightly related point to inform what I'm saying. Look, I think there is no doubt in my mind that Rajiv is right that market abuse per se is something which is not acceptable, right? If there is anybody who is abusing the gateway in any way, particularly to discriminate between a class of people who should not be differentiated between, there's absolutely no question that that is unacceptable. And if that, however, we must recognize that this problem that we are facing about network neutrality is compounded in the Indian regulatory context. And that is something that we are, the truth is that the world over, you would regulate in a technology neutral fashion. You would regulate based on functionality. You have 4 different ways of providing voice telephony. You have fixed lines, you have mobile phones, you have satellite phones, and you have voice over IP. Unfortunately, in our environment, we are unable to regulate all of them in the same way. So if the goal is to regulate by functionality, which is, I think, sound regulatory practice, then clearly there is something wrong in our regulatory approach to some of these services, which is actually compounding the problem, which is actually providing the incentive for people to violate network neutrality. So, because if for instance, it requires you to pay a certain revenue share, and a very significant revenue share, which my friend Rajat has calculated recently all over again, is a very significant revenue share to provide these services, then you cannot say that voice over IP should somehow not attract it. Either those regulatory burdens have to be equal, and I'm not even remotely suggesting that the regulatory burdens must therefore rise on services like voice over IP, because they are actually what we need most currently, because we need to develop data services. But I don't think the regulators are in any position to justify a very, very burdensome regulation on regular voice, conventional messaging, and at the same time say that somehow voice over IP and those should be treated just like any other data.
Okay, so you've got to give up your half a minute because Rajiv has a violent objection.
I think Mahesh is making a very different point.
Indeed.
Which is that, I mean, sorry to use this, but the telcos are getting messed up in their business models because of all this innovation on the net, and therefore they should have a renegotiated settlement on the fees and the license fees that you're paying. Effectively, that's the point you're making. But that has nothing to do with net neutrality.
No.
That is a separate discussion. Yeah, that's a separate discussion. I just want to point that out. That blaming the spectrum bid costs for going and discriminating against consumers and blocking consumers or pricing differentiate consumers is a bit of a tenuous argument. And that is where operators are shooting themselves in the foot. Nobody asked them to bid for it. Yeah. Nobody is asking you to bid price data at the levels that you're pricing. And look, this is the other reality.
We'll come to that.
I just want to make a point and then I'll stop talking.
Is that a promise or a threat?
No, that's a threat. The point I'm making is it is not like the telcos and the access providers are not benefiting from the OTTs and what's happening on the net.
Of course.
Data revenues are all climbing at 80%, 67%, 70% for all of these 3 operators.
They will have to, yeah.
So there is a benefit that is accruing to the access providers from what is happening on the internet. Whether there is an argument that now Rajan has threatened about going to the Supreme Court and getting a settlement with the government, that's a separate issue. That has nothing to do with the material discussion on net neutrality and the rights of consumers.
But what it does have to do with is the fact that most of this discussion about network neutrality has come from the famous TRAI paper, which is totally focused on these issues.
You know,
wrongly in my view. So we know wrongly in my view, but it is focused on those issues. The network neutrality debate in India has arisen entirely because of those issues.
I agree.
Yes.
And it's flawed.
Yeah. So
give a very new point, which is an antitrust point for the panel. You see, how many feature phones do we have in India?
188.
About 500 million, right?
Feature phones.
Smartphones.
180 million.
No.
500 million. And we
Non-smart.
have about 220 million smartphones.
Yeah.
Alive. Right? And out of those 500 million, about 150 million use the internet in some form. Okay. So by allowing differentiated voice. You see this, listen to this very carefully. By allowing differentiated voice, you are discriminating against the feature phone user who has no way to get onto the internet. So if you are allowing the creamy layer to get onto the internet through VoIP, right, at 5 paisa or 10 paisa, you are discriminating against my poor brethren who can't afford to go to the net because they can't afford this mobile phone.
Yeah, that's one of the points that basically is this whole debate about net neutrality for the 15%?
Is it net neutrality or about fairness of the net? And who all is responsible for this? Is it only the operator or other players? Do we know what the other players are doing?
Fair enough, good point. Shubham, you want to make a point?
Let me ask you a question. Did you get the answer to the question that you were asking for?
In a different way, yes.
You didn't get the answer, right?
You give it to me.
I don't know what is with this question that they become complicated by the time they come to me. So you asked about class of service.
Yeah.
The operators mean by class of service that VoIP and normal voice calls are the same. Oh, that's why they should have the same pricing and they should have the same regulation and licensing.
Right.
This is the long and short. Okay. We believe that all OTTs are the same. And VoIP is nothing but an OTT.
Absolutely.
So they should be treated in that class and treated in the same manner. The second question that you asked was to come.
So you say that is it okay to price OTT?
No. For us, the same class of service is not VoIP versus voice, but same class of service is by Skype versus Flipkart.
If
they are all OTTs,
but
they should be priced in the same
belong to more than one
But can you
class.
answer my question that is it okay to have a separate package for VoIP or not?
It's not.
It's
VoIP is an OTT and it should be treated like any other OTT. Very simple.
Why not stop them from, see, currently the telcos prioritize voice. Obviously. So data is restricted.
Yeah, fine, boss, you made your point.
I'm trying to answer his question.
You made your point, Aki, you want to...
The second thing that you made was you compared very unfairly a Flipkart model as a same class of service. Flipkart model is nothing but a proprietary arrangement between Airtel and Flipkart, whereby Flipkart was promised Airtel's customers, not Flipkart's customers, will have access to Flipkart. It's a very different thing and we can talk more about it when we talk about zero rating.
Okay, yeah, fine.
I think the application, they're just different. Application layer is different. And I think more to your question, I think the fundamental point in your question is that at the application layer, switching costs are very low. And there's like so much of competition between apps that scenario which you have on the telco side just doesn't exist. They're just different. They have to be treated differently.
Ranish?
On classes, well, I'm a lawyer. Okay, and we read extensively about this particular question when we look at Article 14 of our Constitution, which is about equality and when you can differentiate between different classes. Okay, and there is a rich jurisprudence, and the thing is, equal packets must be treated equally. Okay, and not all packets are equal. So some packets are about real-time communications. Okay, some packets need higher priority. Now, the application sets that priority, okay, and encodes that into the IP header. So not all packets are equal when it comes to those terms, but does that mean because is real-time communications versus non-real-time a good rational difference when it comes to pricing? The answer is no. So for different kinds of things, for prioritization, there are different classes. When it comes to pricing, they are in different classes. So if, say, what Airtel was trying to do in December, which was to say, if you want access to WhatsApp and to other VoIP services, okay, then you have to have this one packet. You can't use it on your regular internet packet. Okay, that's clearly discriminatory. I can't understand how someone can possibly defend that, because with regard to pricing, with regard to blocking whether you can even access it, okay, there is no difference between a VoIP packet and some other kind of packet. With regard to prioritization, there is. Okay, so this in law is called the rational nexus requirement. Okay, I'm just putting it out there.
Rajan, you want to just quickly react to that?
It's as I said, I don't want to make it any more complex, and I'm afraid it is getting pretty complex. So I'll defer for the moment in terms of saying is that listen, again, getting back to this issue of saying is that listen, it's about customer choice. I think we are overtly trying to complicate something which has to do about customer choice. It is what is the customer wanting in terms of this? When we price and set up our packages, we say, listen, okay, we notice that most of the folks who buy a quote-unquote data pack, which is the fundamental pack that you buy, right? You can then bundle anything else that you want with it. We notice that 90% of the person's time is spent on Google or Facebook or whatever, right? And so we say, listen, rather than just have an undifferentiated price for quote-unquote data services, we'll give you, and it invariably is lower, it's usually not higher, all right? So we sort of give you a package which meets that. So it's differentiated pricing, and I don't know that it's discriminatory in any sense.
Just one clarification question on this, because we can be talking about two different scenarios. One, in which you say you have to buy WhatsApp pack if you want access to WhatsApp. Okay, that's about where you, in your regular internet pack, don't allow someone to access WhatsApp. Okay. There's a very different scenario when you allow through the internet pack access to WhatsApp, and for those who want cost savings, create a separate WhatsApp pack. Now, whether that should be allowed or not is a debate, but it's a separate debate from the former, okay, which just should not ever be allowed.
So part of the debate
and
is
what was happening in December, let me remind you, was where you couldn't access
but please ask
WhatsApp
me, but please tell me, where are these laws codified or these regulations codified anywhere? That it makes you per se say that it's quote inappropriate, illegal, immoral, or whatever.
I'm talking about the ought, not the is.
Okay.
I'm not saying it is illegal, it ought to be illegal.
So we can talk about the oughts, and that's the debate, and saying is that's why we have to say, one, let's first put in place the regulatory and policy framework first. Which is why I argued saying is that we are arguing about the nits and nats without saying what's the overall umbrella under which you can make those decisions.
Fair enough. Jay, if I can get you in, you've come in a little late, but you haven't missed much, because we began by all of us saying that we love net neutrality. One minute. So all of us affirm that we swear by net neutrality. We all love it, etc., etc. But when you get into the specifics, we've got issues. So I wanted, so what this round really was about it. If you have net neutrality, we all love it, etc., etc. Is it allowed to have? I mean, it seems to be very clear that Airtel cannot take money from Flipkart to make its app move, let's say work half a second faster than that of Myntra. So it seems everybody's agreed that that's not allowed. Where, I want your comment is that can you allow this discrimination, if you will, for classes of service? So can you say that I will offer that you can use WhatsApp on your current data pack, but that data pack is not going to get you, the quality of voice is not going to be great because there is no prioritization or something happening. I will give you a data pack which costs more for VoIP. Now, according to you, is that allowed? Should that be allowed? Should that not be allowed? Because there's no law, as Rajan says, but were there to be a law, if you were to make a law in Parliament, for example, would you allow that or would you not allow that?
I should put this in context, and first of all, there's a disclosure. I have family interests in entities that would benefit from the lack of net neutrality, but I have come out in favor of net neutrality in all the aspects of it, and I will just clarify this in a moment. Now, to me, there are two broad issues from which flows the debate on net neutrality. One is the classical free market debate on not allowing cartels to develop. So, this harks back to examples like Microsoft not being allowed by regulators in the US and EU to bundle its browser along with its OS. But in the years that it took for those rulings to take into effect, they killed the pioneer. So, it's ironic that many of the sponsors of some of these data plans and some of these options are entities that grew up because there was net neutrality. The Googles, the Facebooks, the Zomatos, they've all benefited from the fact that deep-pocketed corporate competitors, when these entities were startups, their deep-pocketed corporate competitors could not ensure exclusive special access to customers, which is why these entities got a chance to become big corporates themselves today. Now, so clearly, this is a work in progress. And as was pointed out, a lot of the discussions we are talking about are the oughts and not yet the ises. But it's important to discuss what ought to be. Absolutely, because it will come into our laps soon. As was stated today in Parliament, after TRAI takes its decision, the ministry will take a call, cabinet will take a call, it might go to the courts. And certainly in Parliament, there are many of us who want to legislate to ensure a level playing field for everyone. So with that context, let me just take a minute more and tell you what I think of this. One is the market rationale, the level playing field rationale. The other is something quite interesting. This is regarding the desirability of universal net access and whether it is truly the kind of paradigm shifting thing that happens once in a century rather than once every 5 years, like electricity was or things like that. Which means universality of the internet is also dependent on no fragmentation. Meaning today, anybody can access the internet and go to any site anywhere. It has a freedom of speech angle to it. It has all kinds of other angles to it. So when you talk about prioritization of classes of service, the one thing that is being debated on the zero-rated services or the sponsored data plans is, if you look at what the FCC has done, the FCC is currently hedging its bets. The FCC in the US has taken a decision that you can't choke certain sites and you can't boost certain sites. They have to be treated at the same speed. Now, on the issue of zero-rated sponsored data plans, meaning a site or an app pays a service provider to give free access or cheaper access to customers, provided it only goes to their site. This introduces fragmentation of the internet. Now, is that desirable or not is a question that needs to be deeply discussed, because the internet is not just another communication service for WhatsApp or for Skype or for telecoms to provide voice services. The internet, in fact, the entire IP protocol has come up on the fundamental egalitarian thesis that a packet is a packet is a packet, right? That's been the essence of the internet for 20 years. And this is what many of the telcos and ISPs have had trouble dealing with, because they've got very lucrative voice revenues dating back to circuit switching days. When a packet was not a packet was not a packet, you had different kinds. And in service today, they would like to have differentiated packets, assured service level and all that. So if it brings into question the very essence of the internet, that you can be in a very repressive regime country and yet have access to information all over the world, fragmentation sort of destroys that very essence. So I'm not in favor of anything that allows fragmented access to the internet. That's my viewpoint. Now, although the FCC has hedged its bets on zero-rated plans, the EU is today the cutting edge of what is actually on the verge of some new rulings, and I think we will have to watch that and take that into account when, you know, our thing is actually going to kick in after 24th, after TRI gives a ruling. Now here we need to debate on things like this. Do we start treating the internet for certain critical applications, such as 911 access, such as emergency calling facilities? Or do you want to harness something like the government's Jan Dhan scheme so that financial transactions get some sort of priority? So here, even then, you can talk about classes of service, but certainly not prioritization for one brand over the other.
No, but I'm saying classes of service.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think it's worth having a debate. My gut instinct is that anything that provides some kind of deprioritization to anything at the cost of anything else is a problem. And I think the last thing I want to say on this is, we don't want to get caught into a debate with a scarcity mentality. Meaning, new technologies are coming up all the time. Spectrum may be limited, but access in the future is not going to be limited. There are going to be all kinds of new ways of providing access. So I would rather not have anything that would reprioritize certain packets and prioritize certain other packets. I recognize the issue of whether do you want to use it as a universal 911 service, which would require some prioritization. I'm open to discussing that angle.
If I can just bring in, I mean, Kevin here, you know, since Kevin used to be the head of the FCC, you know, in 2009, and since you brought in the FCC, and if you can just answer this very specific question, that assuming that the FCC rules are the perfect ones, assuming that the FCC rules are the ones that we will, you know, implement, does the FCC allow for a class of services like VoIP to be charging a higher package?
So can you hear?
Yeah,
yeah. Let me answer that, but then also give some context to it as well. So it allows for a class of services to be prioritized, but not for a fee. So what it does is it says that voice over IP and real-time communications an operator can allow those packets to be prioritized in order for them to function appropriately, but it can't offer that separately, that as a separate service for a fee.
Okay.
So what and to put a little bit of context, if I can, just this is obviously, as you can already tell, it's a very complex issue, the net neutrality, and it's been debated for a long time. These issues are at least a decade in the United States when the issues first came up in 2004 and 2005. The context for them actually wasn't the initial assertion of power by the ISPs. It was actually the opposite. It was as there was increasing competition among the ISPs, the government wanted to provide them de-tariffing release and some retail pricing relief. And in that context, the concern was, would they actually use that power to create a two-sided market? And going back to, and I'm sorry, I can't remember your name.
Jay Pandanda.
No, the second person,
Rajiv.
Rajiv said that the whole concept of network neutrality was the idea of not allowing them, carriers and operators, to use their bottleneck or potential bottleneck facilities to move up the stack, to instead of selling access, to move into areas of service where the internet where they might view as more profitable than their access point, but to keep them in access. So as we provided some regulatory relief in terms of the access pricing, we put prohibitions on them of being able to move up the stack, so to speak, right? And that in that context, we didn't want the operators to be able to block or throttle other kinds of applications to create that two-sided market. And so the earliest examples of that were very clear. So it was actually voice operators, telephone companies, actually at first blocking voice over IP calls and say you couldn't access those unless you paid extra. And the commission came in and said you can't do that. And then the second examples were actually cable operators, cable video providers, throttling BitTorrent, which was being used to distribute video programming. Both of those were easy conceptually to understand because they would have an economic incentive to be putting in place barriers to consumers being able to get access to those services. And so those were the kind of evolution of the network neutrality debate and the principles that were originally adopted. Those and I think those are consistent with some of the points that people have made. The one observation that I would just make is that here on the panel and in India, sometimes you're rushing to the most complicated and most difficult issue as opposed to trying to deal with some of the easier ones, right? It's easier, for example, to say should a telephone company be able to block or charge extra for voice and have concerns about the potential anti-competitive impact of that, or for a cable operator to do that on video. The sponsored data and the zero rating issues, as you said, the FCC actually, even in their most recent orders, have still not taken a position on that, and they haven't for a variety of reasons, and one of them is because those are the most complicated and difficult, and there's consumer and interest on those on both sides, and it also goes back to the original purpose of the principles as you talked about. You said that the whole idea was that the operators should be in the access business, and we don't want them creating a two-sided market. But in the sponsored data concept, it's not a two-sided market. It's a one-sided market. It's just being charged the other way. Right? And so it's in that concept that the commission has been hesitant to get as directly involved, and because there's actually a history of that, even in common carrier regulation. When there was long distance charges, they still allowed for toll-free dialing, where in effect the content owner was paying for the consumer to be able to make that long distance call. And but it wasn't a two-sided charge. It was still only a one-sided charge. It was just the content paid instead. And it was an exception. There were still regulations that were put around it to make sure that there were things like it transparent and that it was non-exclusive. But that's part of the reason the commission in the sponsored data context has said the commission has said we don't see sponsored data as a violation of net neutrality. So it's not going to be prohibited. At the same time, we're not saying it's going to always be allowed either. We're going to look at it under the same concepts of, is this going to be something that's pro-consumer, or is it going to be something that is actually being used in a way that's going to be anti-competitive? And so that's, I think, that conceptually the way what the commission is doing, and that's so the simple answer to your question is no. They wouldn't allow charging for a voice packet like that, but they would allow it to be receive prioritization, if that.
And are you okay with the concept of zero rating in the way that's been described?
No, absolutely not. I thought I made that clear because zero rating essentially creates fragmentation.
Perfect, okay.
It creates perhaps a new category of first-time internet user, so that has some benefit. This is what FCC has said. But it does create a sort of what is called a walled garden, in the sense that those who are sponsoring that plan, only their sites or their apps get accessed. Now, if we have an interest in low-cost access for the rural poor, for instance, then we have other ways of getting it. We can do cash transfers, which we are doing for cooking gas, and we are doing for other kinds of things, other kinds of subsidies. If we have a national interest that we must have very low-cost access, then we give cash transfers, and they can do it, but not through tying up between the service provider, the access provider, and the content provider. Let me use an analogy. In the old days, used to have, in the West, used to have coupons that customers could cut out from the newspapers and go and give it at a supermarket to get a discount on a product that they bought. But that was a coupon that was given by the sponsor directly to the customer. It was not given to the supermarket. So I'd be okay with that if an app or a website wants to promote customers to have access to higher speeds so that they can access their services better. Let them, like the government can give cash transfers, they can send coupons so that they can get faster access packages from the service providers directly without the nexus of the ISP or the telco and the sponsor.
Okay, Rajiv, you want to say something?
No, since you're on the zero rating, and I just want to pick up on what was just said. The issue of a existing internet player creating a platform for other applications to be hosted on it, as long as that player is not an access provider, is a very different issue to be dealt with purely on the basis, this is my view, on the basis of anti-competitive, competition law, market presence, predation on the internet. I think you make the mistake by using that, and I think I'm glad you confirmed that is not necessarily net neutrality. That is an ongoing issue of seeing, let's say Facebook, for example, let's use the internet.org example because that's in the media, that if they are abusing their presence on the net to grow bigger by making sure all other apps are throttled and killed because of their market abuse or anything, that is for the Competition Commission and for the existing domestic competition law to intervene, and that's not one time, that is not legislating one time, that is for an ongoing examination of the domestic internet.
Yeah. Okay.
So, on the zero tariffing thing that you're talking about, I have a problem with it as long as it is two side pays. It's a nice phrase. I'm going to use that, and it amounts to going up the stack. But if it is an existing internet player, I think that's fairly and squarely in the Competition Commission domain. It is for them to examine if there are any market abuse practices that are in place. That's my view anyway.
Okay, Rajat, you wanted to comment on
well, I just wanted to ask Kevin a question about, in fact, Rajiv has just raised this point. I just wanted to ask Kevin a question that, discriminatory pricing for VoIP and voice from VoIP is not allowed in the United States at the moment. And this is the point that Rajan made as well a little while ago. In India, there exists no such explicit rule that prohibits differential charging for these data packets that Sunil is talking about. So under what provision in the United States is this not allowed? Was it something that the FCC did, or was it something that was established at the FTC or the equivalent of the Competition Commission?
So I will answer, and I should do one thing just because at the beginning you all went through and talked also about what you do. So I'm currently, I was the former FCC chairman. Yeah. I've been a consultant in the private sector, consultant for both OTT operators, cable providers, for AT&T and telecommunications providers, so across the whole spectrum. But I should have
all your
identified
interests
that.
are evenly balanced.
Right, exactly. So I did want to make that clear as well. So so in the United States, actually, when the first implementation and the first enforcement authority was used to say that the telecommunications provider could not block packets of voice over IP, it was actually under the general telecommunications rules that the carriers operated under. The very reason why these network neutrality issues, as I mentioned, came up were because as the telecommunications operators were going to be de-tariffed and deregulated, the concern became, if the intention was to provide them additional retail pricing flexibility so they would have more income to be able to be investing in their networks, which was a goal of the government, would that position be abused to not change their retail pricing but to move up the stack? And so it was under the general telecommunications rules initially. Then when they removed some of those telecommunications rules, when they declared the internet service not to be a telecommunications service, that was when there was a separate set of network neutrality rules that were adopted. What occurred through a series of court challenges was then the question of whether the commission had authority, if it's not a telecommunications, to adopt separate network neutrality rules. And so what the commission just recently did is said that it was going to reestablish that these were telecommunications services. Now, and then they adopted additional network neutrality rules, but they were all under the rulemaking of just telecommunications services, that they have to be provided on a non-discriminatory basis. That was the source of the authority. So it wasn't a separate anti-competitive authority. It was the telecommunications authority in the first enforcement agency example. It was under separate network neutrality rules until they got overthrown by the courts, and now it's back under the telecommunications authority.
Thank you.
So just to clarify, I mean, Kevin, just to clarify, are you suggesting or are you saying that the internet itself is considered a telecommunications platform?
The internet isn't, the content isn't, but the access to it is. The current ruling is that the access is a telecommunications service. That was the decision that just was released.
So whatever platform it comes off of, it's the access, whatever access.
Whatever the access is. And ironically, there is actually much more consensus in the United States now around that there should be network neutrality rules that prohibit blocking and prohibit throttling and actually don't allow for paid prioritization. The most recent debate is actually on that issue, is should the other forms of access all be under the utility regulatory authority or not?
Okay, can I just get in Ravi Prasad on that? Ravi, yeah. Ravi's been designing networks for a long time and
okay. You see, first on the zero rating, I wanted to point out that zero rating is not a zero-sum game. The benefit to one operator from, to one platform from being on a zero rated, it doesn't mean that a competitor gets his benefit or gets affected by the same margin. If I boost someone by 50% doesn't mean a competing platform gets reduced by 50%. It could get reduced by 10% or 20% or 80%. It's a very complex exercise in game theory, much more complex than the prisoner's dilemma, because the operator has to balance his interests vis-a-vis the interests of the content provider, vis-a-vis the interests of the consumer. And this is a solution which so far has not found a mathematical problem. So I think we're confusing the issue when we talk about zero rating as trying to say that a benefit to one platform, one content provider will harm other content providers. You have to, so far this has not been proved because you're trying to treat it as a zero-sum game with winners and losers when it isn't such a problem.
If it were, I disagree for the following reason. If it were purely a market scenario, I would agree with you. But as I was saying earlier, the very inherent nature, the egalitarian nature of the internet has been unfettered access for everyone on the internet to any site. And when you create a walled garden, that somebody has an access to a particular newspaper site and doesn't have access to another newspaper site because it's sponsored by that one, it affects that very fundamental DNA of the internet of having fragmented, limited access, and I'm against that.
Okay, fair enough. So you have very different points of view on it very clearly. Pranesh, you wanted to say something on this?
Thanks. Since double-sided markets and game theory were already invoked, I don't feel too badly about this. That going into a little bit of the nuance, it's a little bit more complicated even. Because sure, there's the double-sided market that can play in an Airtel Zero kind of situation, but there is also something called a cooperative game that's in existence because already content providers, when they are sending content and receiving content from their users, are paying. Okay, so it's not as though they're not paying, it's only the consumers that are paying, right? both of them are paying. And there are a large number of players in the middle who are also part of these commercial transactions. Okay, and how this gets balanced out, well, there is a theoretical model for it, which a few years ago was also the basis for a Nobel Prize, okay, and it's called the Shapley value, okay, trying to determine in this kind of a cooperative game where everyone benefits, like, and just to take us like back 15 years, okay, at that point, those content providers who were giving free access to their content, we're saying ISPs are benefiting from this. They're able to charge their customers directly. ISPs ought to give us money, which is the exact opposite of the argument being made now by ISPs, right? So the fact is everyone benefits from the existence of the internet. It's not one-sided benefit or the others, you know, so it's not a simple market transaction of that sort, okay, where one ought to pay for the other. Everyone has an interest in this game existing, and what we have to figure out is whether everyone is being paid enough to stay in the game. Right now, ISPs are saying that they aren't, okay, and that's fair enough for them to say, okay, ISPs also have to survive, okay, telecom companies also have to survive. It's just the opinion of many who've analyzed the revenue statements, okay, that ISPs are not going to be harmed by more people taking up, you know, VoIP, okay, and that's, I think, a large part of what the OTT licensing debate, etc., is about, at least in part, that ISPs might have a case insofar as they deserve more money, but this is not the way of going about getting it.
Perfect.
And
okay. This gets me to my next sort of, you know, the point that Rajat made, you know, in his opening remarks, which is that, you know, at the end of the day, we're all talking about how public spaces need to be free because, you know, a road has to be free for everyone. But the problem with this whole public space debate in India is that this public space is being created by private money. You know, if you had all of this created by BSNL, I think it'd be a very different, you know, kind of talk that we'd been having, because it's taxpayers' money which created this park. You know, in fact, there's this video. There are two videos actually. One has been done by the AIB, you know, which is this group in Bombay, and they, you know, they bring in this analogy of a park where they say, you know, a park is meant to be a free space, and, you know, we gave $5 to get into the park, and suddenly these guys say, "Tell me, you want to go on that ride? You better pay a bit more." Yeah. And then there's another, you know, counter video to that, which is not as well made, but that video says that, hey, that's the real world. Yeah. When you go to Disney World, you pay a certain entry fee, so you get to enjoy the ambience, you get to eat the food, you know, you get a few rides free, but if you want to go on certain rides, you better pay for them. Yeah. So, you know, this is the point that if, you know, and, you know, Pranesh, this is the point which the TRAI has made. Now, I think you're contesting their figures, but if I remember that number correctly, what they're saying, Rajan, you bear me out, what the TRAI seems to be saying is that if there's a normal call, you know, a voice call, the operator earns 40 paisa on that call. If that same call is made on VoIP, he earns 1 paisa or 2 paisa. So, you know, if that is indeed correct, and, you know, I mean, I've heard the argument, Kavin Mittal, for example, wrote in the Financial Express that actually the mobile guy, his father should be paying him because he's driving traffic to his father's website, you know, with Hike. But, you know, so the point that's being made here is that if a guy earns 40 paisa in a certain way, and now you're telling him that you can earn 1 paisa or 2 paisa, how are we going to be able to fund the future growth of the internet? You know, Jay, this is a point that you made that, I mean, you know, you're talking about vouchers and we could make payments, for example. 85% of Indians do not have the internet today. The telcos claim, and I guess an auditor can find this out, but the telcos claim that it seems obvious to me that they're cash strapped, that they spend a lot of money. Rajiv said that, you know, why did the telcos need to bid? I think they needed to bid because they needed to stay alive. So having funded the internet with private money, can we actually, and if we say that OTTs are not going to be licensed, it's not going to be, they're not going to pay the same 15% revenue share that the telcos paid, how are we going to build out the internet in India?
Look, you talked about what the real world is, and I would say that the telcos are certainly familiar with what the real world is. The net neutrality debate is not a new one. as pointed out by the former FCC chairman, it's been going on for at least a decade. The term itself was coined 13 years ago. And if they were bidding for spectrum, oblivious of what is happening in the regulatory frameworks of the US and EU, then all I can say is, I'm sorry for you, but you ought to have known better. Now, the second thing I would like to say is India has been an outlier for many years where VoIP has been choked. It has not been allowed to be connected to the PSTN, to the public networks, and this is because of the pressure from the telcos. Now, as a result, they have continued to enjoy these 40 paisa revenues when the rest of the world has gone to 1 paisa revenues because of technology. They should have adapted earlier. I'm not against anybody making profits. I think there are, if the telcos had been more aware, they wouldn't have bid these sums. I'm sure there will be consolidation in the industry. I'm sure there will be shakeout in the industry. But the reality is, to the best of my knowledge, and I have some familiarity with the industry, it is possible for access providers to make money by focusing on access. But if you resist technology, as Indian telcos have been resisting VoIP for the last decade, then suddenly the dam breaks after 10 years. This is the pressure that they are facing. If VoIP had been gradually allowed, as it has been allowed in the US and in the EU, by now they would have got adjusted to making money out of 5 paisa voice revenues rather than 40 paisa voice revenues.
And I can, I think that's a bit of a disingenuous argument, and I think the FCC chairman will say is that, listen, the reason why you had VoIP, it was a landline service, right? And you had almost infinite bandwidth, and it was subsidized very heavily initially when the landline services went out. So everybody had access to a landline service, right? Just about 95% of the population of the US was hooked up. So VoIP could be enjoyed by just about anybody. Mobility came in at the aft end, right? And so when you said as mobility spread, the question was, would you allow a VoIP call to transfer onto a mobile network? Initially, the technology didn't allow it. Forget about anything else. The technology didn't allow that. It's only as we went through and mobility became a dominant network that the technology allowed data to ride on mobile networks. All right, that was a recent phenomenon. It's not an age-old phenomenon. All right, so
let me just quickly respond.
No, I'm saying
mobility has been around for 20 years. Number one.
Yeah, but not data. Not data networks.
Hang on. 3G has been around for close to a decade, and packet switching even on mobile networks, which is 3G, as opposed to circuit switching, which was 2G, has been around close to a decade. Telcos in our country have prevented VoIP from being commercialized because of preventing interconnection to the PSTN, which is why when suddenly the change, if the change had gradually happened over the past 10 years, they would have all adjusted by now.
So now one must ask, where was the government in all of this is going on?
So my point is,
where's the government, the regulator and the government?
Let me complete what I'm saying. No, so my point is, if telcos find it difficult to survive, if they're not getting 40 paisa revenues on voice, then this revolution was coming. It was evident all over the world, and they should have bid for spectrum accordingly.
And the government of India should have actually kept the reserve price very low, which they didn't.
So I think, first of all, I think to counter this issue, we're saying is that, first of all, it's as if you had a choice for the consumer. The consumer only had one choice, which is the mobility network, and the government regulated the mobility network from day one. All right, so it was not as if the government was unaware of all of these issues going on. So why the government, in a heavily regulated industry, didn't step in and put the policy issues in place is a different question. Now, let me move on to this issue of saying is that...
the point actually that Jay is making is that the reason why the government never stepped in is because the telcos didn't told them that don't step in.
So when in a 12 market, in a 12 operator, I mean, thank you very much. I mean, that's a pretty big compliment. When we've been fighting and we are going to the courts and we've had to fight CDMA battles and we had to do all of this stuff to say that we had this dominant power to influence the government, my gosh, that's, I think a bit of a stretch of the imagination over here. So I don't think that is completely fair. So the whole issue of saying is that why wasn't VoIP allowed onto it was a regulatory call. All right, we had nothing to do with it. Okay, all right. When initially, when it started off, right, when it said, look, VoIP, on the long distance side, we competed against the Skypes of the world. All right, so it wasn't as if we didn't. We didn't say, oh my gosh, why did you have ILD licenses,
I get your point.
NLD licenses? All of these licenses were disaggregated by the government.
Okay, I get your point. Rajat, before I get you in, I just want to ask you, Jay, a question. So clearly these guys didn't see the writing on the wall and they bid, in a mad manner. So let's assume for the sake of argument that, as in any, half-decent country, you let them go bankrupt and, these telcos are out of the game. At 1 paisa per minute of a VoIP call, how do we actually start building out the internet? Because as I said, if the government was funding the rollout of the network,
listen,
it was one thing.
I got the question. I'm not saying the government is blameless. Clearly, the government wasn't ahead of the curve, and certainly it's partly responsible for the mess that we are in. But it was only the telcos who benefited from VoIP not being allowed to interconnect to the PSTN.
I think there's a failure of the landline service.
No, all telcos. Even mobile also benefited from not interconnecting to PSTN. That's clear. I mean, that's a fact. It's not an opinion. Number two, hang on,
please go ahead.
That's one thing. Now, how do we go forward? Look, the telcos have actually contributed to a fund, Universal Service Obligation Fund, which the government is sitting on. We've got billions of dollars. I've raised this question many times in Parliament over the past 5-7 years, and they're sitting on huge sums of money, which, to give credit where the credit is due, telcos have contributed.
Yeah, 5% of the revenues.
Right?
Yeah.
So this money ought to be used to roll out and make internet access available to all over the country, and the government has to chip in with its share.
So let me just clarify one thing, and Rajat is here. All right, the reason that the regulator did not allow the interconnect is because they couldn't enforce it. That's the issue. Please, he's here.
To be fair to Rajan, the initial reluctance to do VoIP calls was due to BSNL and DOT, and later the mobile operators. But the initial trigger was really to protect the incumbent landlines. Can I?
That was 10 years back, right?
Yeah, that.
Now to more recent times when the operators
yeah,
have been
but still, the issue was
you still got to do it.
The issue was in terms of charging the license fee and the spectrum usage fee, all of these in terms of interconnect. If you were allowed the interconnect, you would have had to pay an interconnect charge. It wouldn't be free. We would have been competing with you. Hello.
I agree with you, Rajan. What I'm saying is that you have choked it. Ever since it has been allowed to the universal access program, of course you have choked it.
What's that?
You have not provided, none of the operators have provided OTTs, VoIP services, even after it was allowed.
No, if anybody has a data pack, you can go on and you can do it. If you have a smartphone,
you have not allowed it on your platform. That's what I'm saying.
No, because it's regulatory wise stopped. We cannot, if you have data services, who prevents you from accessing? People can download Skype on your smartphone.
Sir, well, actually, that's not fully true. In that there are some SIP providers. If you go to on certain networks, some SIP providers, which are essentially VoIP providers, are blocked in India right now. Okay, you have to use a VPN to disguise the fact that you're using VoIP in order to connect to those SIP providers, and that's a fact.
Rajat, you need to come in on this.
Rajat. Which Rajat? Oh, okay.
Can I?
Yeah. The other Rajat? No.
Can we give the mic here to the gentleman with the...
Ravi.
No, I just wanted to clarify that this is actually all the points which may seem as myths. The reality is you don't need a VPN connection. You can actually do a data call anytime, anywhere. I have a large number of my customers on my network who are currently using VoIP. So it's got nothing to do with the VPN. As far as, since I've been asked. As far as Mr. Panda's point is concerned, the question of interconnection with the network, sir, Mr. Rajan Matthews' point was very correct, that originally the technology did not permit it. It is true also that at one point of time it has been stopped because of various reasons, to protect the incumbent operator, etc. But as you correctly pointed out yourself, sir, 2G at one point of time did not support packets, and therefore there was no question of any data connectivity through that. It was subsequently when 3G started that data did get supported, and that's when the VoIP platforms have been used by a lot of operators. And again, the same point, to my understanding and to my knowledge, there's not a single operator today who is throttling it. So just a couple of myths, I thought. Sunil, thank you very much for that.
You want to go to Ravi behind you? Yeah. Ravi wants to make a point, yeah.
No, you were talking about making a law which you can't enforce, which was the VoIP thing. But I want to say, how are you going to technically build a network which is net neutral? Because you cannot, how are you going to detect violations of net neutrality and where different content providers are being treated the same? You cannot do it practically. You cannot build a network which will detect violations of net neutrality. So what's the point of trying to enforce a regulation which is going to be difficult to implement? Now, for example, let's say in VoIP, I use something like Red Phone, which is a VoIP service, which is heavily encrypted so that my calls cannot be listened into. Now, that certainly is treated at a has much greater latency than, let's say, a Skype call or a WhatsApp call. So you're having VoIP packets being treated very differently at different latencies because one is heavily encrypted and the others are not heavily encrypted. So it's practically impossible to build a network which will detect violations of net neutrality in fairly quickly.
Yeah, Mahesh, you wanted to get on it. Just 1 minute. Mahesh and then Rajat and then Pranesh. You wanted to get on. Yeah. Carry on. You don't need a mic. Your mic's up.
Okay. Thanks. No, I think there are two distinctly distinct points here, and I think Mr. Panda's point is certainly half correct, which is that currently voice over IP calls are not possible to be terminated on the PSTN despite the regulation not specifically barring that. So clearly that is a commercial decision, rightly or wrongly, that operators, it is not barred by regulation. However, the second point, of course,
he's saying it is barred by regulation.
Okay, well, I'd like to hear about that because my own inquiries with operators offline suggest that it is not barred by regulation, but that's a different point. The second point is, of course, that I sort of beg your decision. I made that point earlier. The fact is that voice over IP calls currently are also subject to certain regulatory advantages, which clearly then create new problems. As I mentioned earlier, for all other types of telephony calls, you do pay a revenue share as license fees as well as spectrum charges, etc., etc.
15% of revenue.
Yeah, 15% of revenue, which is coming down. But yeah, I think Rajat calculates it's about 11% now.
No.
Yeah, but yeah, but I think average. Now, 11% of that kind of revenue is thousands of crores of rupees. Now, that is not a trivial sum of money, and if we do regulate based on functionality, then there is clearly a problem. And my humble suggestion is that what this net neutrality debate is doing is unraveling our licensing regime, because it has so many anomalies which are actually going to make it even more difficult to achieve the kind of network neutrality that we do want to have and we do all support. So unless we deal with those issues, we are going to have other concerns also.
Rajat, Jay wants to make a point, and Rajat, and you go ahead.
No, I agree. I think you've raised a valid point that if we ask for a level playing field for the OTTs, then when you are paying a license fee for that service and you are sort of grandfathered, you've done it ahead of time, you need to have a level playing field. So that is a valid argument, and we need to address that. So as far as the argument goes that OTTs should be unregulated, I'm generally in favor of that because it promotes entrepreneurship, it promotes innovation, it promotes all kinds of benefits down the line. But to the extent that OTTs have commercialized their services and there's an apples to apples comparison, like voice for instance, I think perhaps there is a taxation angle to it that needs to be looked into.
In fact, a technician angle, what does that mean?
Taxation.
In fact, I might even add one more thing, and again in support of the previous point, that unlike almost any mature country, ours has a new complication relating to network neutrality, because I think there is virtually no fee that an operator in the US or for that matter in Europe or anywhere else that we're talking about. I'm not aware of these specific countries, but by and large, the vast majority of countries, in fact, whether you're a VoIP player or whether you're a PSTN player, you do actually have similar regulatory burdens as when it comes to fees. In fact, as you yourself referred to, in the European Union now and various other countries, there is now a concern about removing other regulatory burdens that currently face the PSTN players. So, I mean, whether it is the obligation to provide wholesale rates, whether it's the obligation to interconnect and various other things. In most parts of the world, even today, the PSTN players or the network players are much more highly regulated. And since they are competing on services which are functionally similar, we will have to review that. And I think in India, because we have more anomalies, we need to worry about it more.
Rajat, and then Pranesh wants to make a point.
I just wanted to make a couple of quick points, which is following from what Jay and Mahesh have said, which is that these distinct regulatory burdens on different services has created a lot of anomalies and arbitrage within India. And I think it's better, rather than going up to a level, you revert down to the mean or go down. I mean, that's a better way to remove and try and create the level playing field that Jay is talking about. On the other, given that, in terms of revenue maximization for the government, there are other means, but in a non-distortionary manner, that the government can actually collect revenue, let's say through auctions or through other means, but not, revenue share at best should be an instrument of last resort, and even then it should be one which doesn't, distort across functionalities and services. And I think the government is beginning to think along those lines.
No, I think you're so completely wrong, but the government wants to get a high auction fee and then a high revenue share. So I don't know where you're getting this optimism from.
There is a reduction in license fee in the OFIC. There is.
It takes an optimist to be an optimist these days.
Okay.
Obviously
we'll take that.
We'll take that offline. The other point. Sorry. Right. Sure. I mean, economists love to work with averages. So,
especially when it comes to oceans.
Pranesh wants to make a point.
I just wanted to make one more point. We need to kind of not mix the issue of net neutrality vis-a-vis OTT licensing. We have to keep those two separately. I mean, if you are going to confound the two issues, then you're going to come up with policies and instruments which will further distortion.
And then after that, Pranesh, yes, sir.
Gentlemen, with about half a century of experience in IT.
Can you identify yourself, because the
Vipin Mahajan, I'm a retired CIO. I'm into civil society now. I put in about half a century of all this stuff when punch cards were the ruling thing. I'm now into cloud computing and all the fun stuff. I treat IT not as these crossing the T's and dotting the I's, etc. I treat IT as something which can get 3/4 of humanity out of poverty, make a sustainable living and all that. If you keep that in mind, a lot of these things are, petty politics. Now, we have today technology which even an average Indian can afford, which is more powerful than the mainframes which you started, the smartphone which each of you have in your pocket. We also have technology which does not need big mainframes which cost humongous amounts, and even a small chap can rent out a piece of the cloud computing.
What is the point you're making?
The point I'm trying to make is these two technologies are linked up with something called the net. The net speed decides a lot. You're talking about neutrality, etc. So one is getting half an Mbps, somebody is getting 2 Mbps. Why can't we? Technology already exists about 100 Mbps, etc. freely. So why can't we increase the speed altogether? The increased speed does not work in India.
Somebody needs to pay for it.
Why can't we boil the ocean, I suppose, is the better question.
The problem is, most of our servers are not, cloud servers are not in India.
We can't
so you're really paying for the thin pipe which is connecting them over the... If we can bring more servers into India, I don't see any reason why each district or each state does not have a big cloud server.
Pranesh, and last
if you do that, you won't have this argument. You'll have an argument, how do we make more?
You get the last point, and then we got to go for tea because the tea is getting cold.
Excellent. So I want to reiterate two things and end with two complications. So one, the fact that the use of the USOF fund is not being adequately used right now. Okay, and that provides a great amount of a great way, either by reducing the amount that corporations are contributing to USOF and requiring them to do something else, or by the government directly using that fund.
The problem with the USOF fund is that it's being collected and it's being sequestered by the government, and it's being used to fund useless government companies. So you've got BBNL, which has got that money.
It's coming down.
Yeah. So essentially, if you're talking about internet for poor people, okay, universal access to the internet, okay, then for operational costs for that, okay, the USOF fund is something we can be looking at. Okay, so it's not something that's just a mythical dream. I think it is possible. Okay, and zero-rated services are a very small pie. Okay, we actually need to increase access. That's a larger issue. Okay, a few other things. One, the second thing I want to kind of plus one is the point that we need to decrease the regulatory burden on ISPs as they currently exist. So that's the argument I'm most favorable to, that there is a regulatory imbalance and we need to not remove it completely, we need to decrease that, okay, in some sectors. Two complications. One, all VoIP is not the same. Okay, there are centralized VoIP services like Skype, etc. There are things that are completely peer-to-peer. Okay, WebRTC, okay, is VoIP. It is video and voice over internet protocol, but you can't go after any one player demanding tax. Okay, so in a peer-to-peer system, okay, these kinds of regulations just can't work. So we need to be aware of that while we are designing the regulations and not, for instance, prohibit such peer-to-peer communications. Two, there was one other complication that I had in mind, but I'll leave that for now.
Okay, just one last question. In this whole process of, let's say assume for the sake of argument that we get the license burden the same and stuff like that, who's going to be monitoring all these calls? We've got this law which says that a telecom operator has to provide the IB, the CBI, the RAW, and blah blah blah, a pipe. So if Viber or Skype, if providing a call, are they supposed to provide a pipe to the IB so it can monitor it, or how does that work?
No, that I think is the easier part.
That
is already...
The point I was trying to make is, that just can't be done if you are allowing endpoints, okay, me, rather than Viber or anyone to do the encryption, okay, then they can't go after any one company demanding that, like BlackBerry.
But that's the problem. The government of India insists they're going to cancel your license if you don't tell them what that call is about.
And I'm saying that's just backward thinking. Okay, we can't, as a country, okay, move forward by saying that you're going to block all services that allow for encryption.
But that's why we're saying the policy. That's why I'm saying fix the policy. Fix the policy.
A very non-neutral statement to make.
Okay. Anyway. Thanks a lot in the panel, and thank you very much everybody in the audience.
Asim had a question.
We sort of running out of time. I think tea is getting cold. So I think we'll take a lot of these questions offline. Sure. And thank you very much. It's been an enlightening discussion.
Thank you.
It's an expensive phone we can take.